issues very recently with things like the Glasgow, the newly developed Glasgow Caribbean Centre for Development, the appointment of Professor Oliver Ortelli at Bristol. So just wondering, why do you think this issue has become so pronounced now? Like, why now, I guess the question.
I don't know if this is a direct answer, but I think it's related. I think it's really important for us to think about this as really a long-term project, that it mustn't become some kind of trendy fad. Because you do hear that kind of language sometimes, kind of like, oh, this is the hot topic, or this is the thing that's in, and we've got to really watch for that, because this is something that is hundreds and hundreds of years of damage, and it may take several generations for us to undo this. I think that certain voices are being heard more, because there's been an awful amount of work done about this for decades, as we've been saying. I think social media has helped in terms of bringing in different voices and making them, amplifying those voices. I also think we're going through some very strange political times as well. So the nation is quite shaken, and we're starting to look at our narratives, and that's forcing us to then look at our past and see how we're going to create different relationships in the world.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd add also that this is a very long-standing struggle. I suppose I would identify a couple of kind of moments that have led up in the last sort of medium-term past that have led us to where we are today. One is that Caribbean nations have started to fight in the courts for reparations, and have CARICOM put in a claim against several European countries for reparations for slavery a few years ago, and I think that's been significant for bringing this kind of to the table internationally, as well as similar kinds of claims that are being made in the United States. I also think that what happened in 2007, which was the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, during that year there was a great deal of discussion about what that meant, and there was a lot of activists campaigning against a narrative that was purely about a kind of idea of generosity, of British generosity, to end the slave trade. And I think that stimulated a lot of discussion and analysis that really moved things forward, and we're sort of seeing the fruits of that now. But I'd also add to what Lisa said, that this is a very unstable moment, I think, and I think that some of these gains could quite easily be lost. I think there's a really concerted backlash going on, and an active contesting of the claims that slavery and empire are fundamental to British history. I think you can see that in government. You can see the kinds of response that somebody like David Lammy gets when he talks about the history of slavery as being really important for Britain, for why he's here in Britain now, and even for mentioning that kind of thing, or talking about Windrush, he gets enormous racist backlash on social media. So there's a kind of a big desire to deny, among an important chunk of the population, to deny the significance of slavery and empire, and I think we have to be kind of vigilant against that rather than not complacent.
I think we have different views, but I think that as an ex-academic, I retired in 2005. But if we look at this history very carefully, what we will find is that some of the greatest myths, and I call it self-serving academic myths, where academics, in fact, dealt with this slavery, but mainly in terms of abolition, the role of Scotland in abolition, and the fact that it got out of hand with the Joseph Knight case. And the Joseph Knight case is a case that was held just down the road at the Court of Session in 1774 to 1778. And this is a black boy brought back from Jamaica to Scotland, and he wanted his freedom. And his owner, the Weatherburn, Sir John Weatherburn, would not give him his freedom. The case ended up in the Court of Sessions. And that case, 12 of the most senior judges in Scotland were involved in that case. Lord Arniston, Lord Auchinleck, that's Boswell's father. We had Lord Keynes of Keynes Road. We have the Solicitor General. We had the Lord Advocate. And this is about a boy who runs away. And this is in the Court of Session. And academics have used that case. If you look at any law book about slavery and freedom, the Joseph Knight case is quoted. Because the judges allowed Knight to be separated from his owner. That's the Weatherburns. But academics have used that case to say this is a white court releasing a black person. And what they've said is that Joseph Knight was a slave. Now, I say Joseph Knight had a white wife in Edinburgh. He, in fact, wasn't a chattel slave. The slaves in the Caribbean had no right to life. That didn't apply to Knight. But that case is where academics have said that Knight was a slave. Therefore, the fact that he was released in Edinburgh, it meant Scotland abolished slavery. It meant, in fact, a white court abolished slavery to give a black person his freedom in Edinburgh, while 800,000 people were enslaved in the Caribbean with no right to life. And it is that kind of dishonesty which has brought us to this position that this work has had to be driven by people outside academic institutions. And therefore it is terribly important that this work is driven properly by academics like your professor here, because it is this myth that has gone into the public's mind that, in fact, it is self-serving that we abolished slavery in 1778. Okay, we're involved till 1838, but, that balances it. And therefore, this is why the general public finds it so difficult to understand this reversal, which they've been subjected to for 200 years. Suddenly, they're expected to get a new view of black people. And in fact, I was at the council chamber yesterday, where in fact the council removed funding for black children. And I pointed out to the councillors that there are 20 of you sitting over there who are all white, making a judgment of a whole load of people on the other side who are mainly black, still in 2020. And therefore, one of the reasons why we have this problem is that we're now talking about diversity and inclusion. The point is people are still struggling. Why should we include them when they are inferior? They're second rate. They're not going to be able to manage our society. And that is where now we need to do the work, which Professor Tom Devine now, when he gives a lecture, he says, mea culpa. Because what he's really saying, he should have stated, as he did in his most recent book, that slavery made Scotland great. And it is our fault as academics, we've not done enough, and therefore it's for us to reverse the myth that, in fact, we have actually fed the public with. And I'm very sympathetic with the public, because the public is now changing. And we must try and ensure that that progresses.